So, now let's get into some more than the historicity of determinism. Now, you're already showing that it's not just a New Testament, all of a sudden new thing that's coming up. It's not just a Reformed teaching that's just all of a sudden coming up in the 15th and 16th century. But is there some history, or were the early Christians more of a free will type mentality, or were they also determinist?
Well, you always have, according to the book of Ecclesiastics, these philosophies are always here. There's always people who believe in free will. There's always people who have pagan mentalities. But just like we know from the Old Testament, there's always people who believe in God's absolute predestination. They're not always that easy to spot throughout history. And in our situation, you have to keep in mind that the Catholic Church had something called the Inquisition, and one of its main jobs was not only to identify people who disagreed with Catholicism, medieval Catholicism, but also to murder them and to destroy their writings. And so they worked very hard through the Dark Ages to eliminate traces of anything that disagreed with them. So, but they failed. They couldn't eliminate all of them. We can point to Augustine, obviously. His latter writings, especially his book, The Enchiridion. If you haven't got that or read it, I certainly recommend that. That is some real strong Calvinism in that book. And when I like to say Calvinism in that book, because people say, wait a minute, like you mentioned, isn't that a 16th century term? Well, yes, it is. But when I'm using the definition of it, you'll find that definition used throughout church history and even in the Apostles. So, again, I'm working that term. But yes, the Enchiridion is excellent. I would recommend anybody to look up the history of Gottschalk, 9th century monk. He was very well known for teaching absolute predestination. In fact, he was martyred for it. If you look to the Catholic writers, Anselm and Aquinas, they did not believe what we believe on predestination, obviously, but they spent a lot of time writing treatises against absolute predestination. And you don't typically write works against something unless someone is out there.
Right. Good point.
I can't 100% logically say that because they wrote this treatise that therefore somebody was teaching it, but it really doesn't make sense. You normally don't spend that type of time writing against predestination unless you've been confronted with somebody who's teaching it, or somebody comes and says, I talked to this guy and I can't answer it. So they definitely spent time on that, and that kind of gives us the hint that yes, it's definitely around, although we may not be able to see it. Luther's work, The Bondage of the Will, fantastic. If you haven't read that, you need to read that. That is absolutely a necessity for your Reformed education. But yeah, you can go back in the church history and you'll find traces and people who do teach it. But even if you were not, let's say you can't find it at all, then that still doesn't negate the fact that it's biblical. Because as Calvinists, we believe in sola scriptura, and we can only form our beliefs based on what Scripture alone teaches. It's our final authority, not secular history. But you can find it in history.
Right. And I noticed even in the basics of monotheism, let's even say that, not even go into Christianity, even the basics of monotheism, the most basic expression of it is that most people believe that their God is in control of everything. I mean, even the Muslims think that.
Yes.
And so when you look back at Christianity, even from the very beginning, they understood that God is in control of everything that happened to them, good and evil, is God was in control.
Absolutely. And this is because, in my opinion, and I think this is what the Bible teaches, you may not have heard this, all other religions spring from Christianity. And we saw at the Tower of Babel when people were separated, they took with them what they had learned about the Bible, at least at that point, Christianity. And so as time goes on, it separated from the source, it alters and changes, and no longer is recognizable as biblical Christianity. But yes, and any doctrine of creation presupposes predestination. There's no way around that. If God is all-knowing and God created, then God knew He was going to create, and He obviously had a plan for it. And that, of course, logically leads to absolute predestination. There's no way around it.